The howling wind battered the stagecoach mercilessly as Josephine Winters clung to her seat. The January blizzard of 1873 turning what should have been a straightforward journey to Silverton, Colorado, into a fight for survival. The other passengers, an elderly couple and a traveling salesman, exchanged worried glances as the driver's shouts became increasingly frantic above the roar of the storm. "We're losing the trail," the driver called down, his voice barely audible through the wooden panels. "Can't see more than a foot ahead." Josephine pulled her woolen coat tighter around her slender frame, her 22 years having never prepared her for such ferocity from Mother Nature. She had left Boston with dreams of establishing a schoolhouse in the growing mining community, bringing education to the children of prospectors and shopkeepers alike. Now, as the stagecoach lurched violently to one side, those dreams seemed impossibly distant. A sickening crack split the air, followed by screams as the stagecoach tilted. Josephine felt herself airborne for a terrible moment before crashing down onto the hard, packed snow. Pain lanced through her shoulder, and the world spun in dizzying circles. Through blurred vision, she watched the panicked horses drag what remained of the stagecoach away, the driver desperately trying to regain control. "Wait," she cried, struggling to her feet. "Please wait," but her voice was swallowed by the storm. The other passengers were nowhere to be seen, perhaps still inside the coach as it disappeared into the swirling white void. Josephine stood alone, her trunk and belongings scattered across the snow, the bitter cold already seeping through her city-bought clothes. "Hello," she called, turning in a slow circle. "Is anyone there?" Only the howling wind answered. Panic threatened to overwhelm her as reality set in. She was stranded in an unfamiliar wilderness, in the midst of a blizzard with night rapidly approaching. With trembling hands, she gathered what she could, her carpet bag, a blanket that had fallen from the coach, and tried to determine which way to go. The wind cut through her like knives, and within minutes, her fingers grew numb despite her gloves. Each step became more difficult as the snow deepened around her ankles. The logical part of her mind knew she needed shelter, but in every direction stretched only endless white. "Keep moving," she told herself, teeth chattering violently. "Just keep moving." An hour passed, perhaps time lost meaning in the monotonous struggle. Josephine's strength waned, her steps becoming unsteady. The cold had seeped into her bones, and a dangerous drowsiness began to overtake her. She knew what that meant. Her father, a physician, had once treated patients with frostbite and had warned of the deadly comfort that preceded freezing to death. "I will not die here," she whispered, though her legs buckled beneath her, sending her sprawling into the snow. "I cannot die here." As darkness descended, blurring the boundary between land and sky, Josephine thought she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. A hallucination, surely her mind offering comfort in her final moments, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. "Hello," she called, her voice weak. "Please help me." Through the curtain of snow emerged a silhouette, a horse and rider, moving purposefully despite the storm. The figure dismounted in one fluid motion, approaching cautiously. "Madam, are you hurt?" The deep voice belonged to a man, his face obscured by a bandana pulled up against the cold. "The stagecoach," Josephine managed, her lips numb and uncooperative. "It overturned the others. Don't try to talk." The man knelt beside her, assessing her condition with quick, practiced movements. "You're half frozen. We need to get you somewhere warm." Without asking permission, he scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. Despite her predicament, Josephine felt a flash of impropriety being handled so intimately by a stranger, but survival quickly overrode social concerns. "My things," she protested weakly. "Your life's worth more than whatever's in that bag," he said firmly, though he still reached down to grab her carpet bag with one hand while supporting her with the other. "Hold on to me. My cabin's not far." He lifted her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, wrapping one strong arm around her waist while taking the reins with the other. Josephine felt herself pressed against his chest, his body radiating heat like a furnace compared to her chilled form. "I'm Jedediah," he said close to her ear as they began moving. "Jedediah Porter. Josephine Winters, she replied through chattering teeth. I'm much obliged, Mr. Porter, just Jed. He nudged his horse forward. And save your strength, Miss Winters, storm's getting worse. Josephine tried to stay alert, but exhaustion and cold pulled her toward unconsciousness. She was vaguely aware of the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them, of Jedediah's solid presence behind her, of the way he occasionally tightened his hold when she swayed too far to one side. Stay with me, he urged whenever her head drooped. Talk to me, Miss Winters. What brings a lady like you out to these parts? The question required more energy than she possessed to answer fully, but she forced herself to respond. Teaching children. A schoolteacher, then, he said, sounding impressed. Silverton's lucky to have you if we can get you there in one piece. They rode for what seemed like an eternity through the blinding snow before a dark shape loomed ahead, a small cabin nestled against a stand of pines, barely visible through the storm. Here we are, Jed announced, guiding his horse to a small stable attached to the side of the structure. Almost there, Miss Winters. Just stay awake a little longer. Dismounting quickly, he lifted Josephine down, carrying her to the cabin door. Her awareness came in fragments: the scrape of a key, a rush of slightly warmer air, the smell of wood smoke and coffee, the sudden absence of howling wind as the door closed behind them. The cabin was simple but neat: one main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, a bed in the corner, and a table with 2 chairs. A dying fire cast weak light across worn wooden floors. Jedediah laid her gently on a bearskin rug near the fireplace, then moved with surprising efficiency for such a large man. He stoked the fire, adding logs until flames leapt high, casting golden light throughout the small space. Your clothes are soaked through, he said matter-of-factly. You need to get out of them. Despite her numbed state, Josephine felt heat rise to her cheeks. Sir, I couldn't possibly. You'll die of exposure otherwise, he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. He moved to a trunk, pulling out a flannel shirt and woolen trousers. These will swim on you, but they're dry. I'll turn my back. Josephine hesitated, decades of proper Boston upbringing warring with the reality of her situation. I can't feel my fingers well enough to manage the buttons. Jedediah stood still for a long moment, clearly weighing propriety against necessity. Finally, he sighed. I've got a sister back in Missouri. I'll help you the way I'd help her, with respect. He knelt beside her, his movements clinical and impersonal as he helped her remove her sodden coat, the high-collared blouse beneath stiff with ice. His hands were calloused but gentle, his eyes carefully averted whenever possible. I'm a rancher, not a doctor, he said, clearly trying to put her at ease as he helped her into his oversized shirt. But I've seen frostbite before. We need to warm you gradually. Once she was changed into his dry clothes, he wrapped her in several blankets and positioned her closer to the fire. Only then did he tend to his horse, returning minutes later with a light dusting of snow on his broad shoulders. Storm's getting worse, he reported, removing his coat and hat. Without them, Josephine could see him clearly for the first time. Jedediah Porter was tall and broad-shouldered, perhaps 30 years old, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of years working outdoors. His hair was dark brown, almost black, his jaw strong beneath several days' growth of beard. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a clear, startling blue, like summer sky reflected in still water. How are you feeling? He asked, hanging his wet clothes by the fire. Warmer, she admitted, though painful tingling had started in her extremities as circulation returned. Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Porter. Just Jed, he reminded her, moving to the small kitchen area. And you're welcome, though any decent man would have done the same. He set a pot of water to heat on the stove. You mentioned a stagecoach. Were you the only passenger? No. The memory rushed back with sickening clarity. There were others, an elderly couple, a salesman, the driver. The coach overturned, and somehow I was thrown clear. The horses panicked and dragged the coach away. I tried to follow, but... She trailed off, distress evident in her voice. Jed's expression grew grim. Which direction were you headed? To Silverton. From Durango, he nodded, seeming to calculate something. That road passes about 2 miles east of here. The driver might have regained control and continued on, or they might have sought shelter elsewhere. He poured hot water into a cup, adding coffee grounds. "Nothing to be done tonight. Come morning if the storm's passed, I'll ride out and look for signs of them." "I should help," Josephine said, attempting to rise but finding her limbs uncooperative. "You should rest," Jed countered firmly. "You nearly froze to death out there." He handed her the steaming cup. "Drink this. It'll help warm you from inside." The coffee was strong and bitter, but the heat of it flowing down her throat was heavenly. As she drank, Jed prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and biscuits that looked to be left over from his breakfast. "It's not fancy," he apologized, setting a plate before her. "It's perfect," she assured him, suddenly ravenous. As she ate, she studied her surroundings more carefully. The cabin was utilitarian, but showed signs of care. Books lined a small shelf, a handmade quilt covered the bed, and a few sketches of landscapes were pinned to one wall. "Have you lived here long?" "5 years," Jed replied, settling across from her with his own plate. "Came west after the war, looking for something different. You fought in the war between the states?" she asked cautiously, noting a certain guardedness enter his expression. "Union cavalry," he confirmed with a brief nod. Afterwards, St. Louis felt too crowded, too full of memories. Headed west, worked cattle drives for a while, then staked a claim on a small ranch about a mile north of here. He gestured vaguely. "This cabin was here first. Use it sometimes when I'm checking fence lines or when the weather turns bad suddenly." Josephine found herself wanting to know more about this taciturn man who had saved her life, but exhaustion was quickly overwhelming her. Her eyelids grew heavy despite her efforts to stay alert. Jed noticed immediately. "You should sleep," he said, rising to take her empty plate. "Take the bed." "I'll keep the fire going." "I couldn't possibly take your bed," she protested weakly. "You're not taking it, I'm offering it," he replied with unexpected gentleness. "And I insist." Too tired to argue further, Josephine allowed him to help her to the narrow bed in the corner. The moment her head touched the pillow, consciousness began to slip away. "Thank you," she murmured, her eyes already closing, "for saving my life." The last thing she heard before sleep claimed her was his quiet response. "Get some rest, Miss Winters, you're safe now." Josephine woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The rough wooden ceiling above her was unfamiliar, as was the weight of the heavy quilts piled atop her. Then memory rushed back. The stagecoach, the blizzard, the cowboy who had found her half frozen in the snow. She sat up slowly, her body aching in protest. Sunlight streamed through frosted windows, revealing the cabin in daylight for the first time. Jedediah stood by the stove, his back to her as he tended to something in a cast iron skillet. "Good morning," she said, her voice still rough from sleep. He turned, surprise briefly crossing his features before settling into a small smile. "Morning." "Was beginning to wonder if you'd sleep the day away." Josephine glanced toward the window, alarmed. "What time is it?" "Just past 9, he replied, returning his attention to the skillet. "Storm blew itself out around dawn. How are you feeling?" She took inventory of herself, muscles sore, fingers and toes still sensitive, but blessedly warm and alive. "Much improved, thank you." "Hungry?" Without waiting for an answer, he transferred eggs and bacon onto a plate and brought it to her. "Eat, you'll need your strength." The simple breakfast tasted better than any fine meal she'd had in Boston. As she ate, she became acutely aware of her disheveled appearance, her hair falling loose from its pins, wearing a man's clothes, sitting in a bachelor's bed. Her mother would have fainted at the impropriety of it all. "I should," she began uncertainly, "that is, I would like to make myself presentable. Is there somewhere I might?" Understanding dawned in Jed's eyes. "Of course, there's a wash basin on the table there. I'll step outside to check on the horse. Your clothes should be dry by the fire." He donned his coat and hat, tactfully giving her privacy. Josephine moved quickly, washing her face and hands in the cold water, trying to restore order to her tangled auburn hair with just her fingers. Her own clothes, neatly laid out by the fire, were indeed dry, if somewhat wrinkled. She changed hurriedly, folding Jed's borrowed clothes and placing them at the foot of the bed. She had just finished buttoning her blouse when a knock sounded at the door. "Come in," she called, smoothing her skirts self-consciously. Jed entered, stamping snow from his boots. His gaze briefly took in her restored appearance, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "Snow's deep, but the sky's clear," he reported. "I'll ride out shortly to look for the stagecoach. Your things from last night are by the door." Josephine looked to where her carpet bag sat, suddenly remembering the others from the coach. "I should come with you. The elderly couple, the Hendersons, they might need help." Jed's expression turned serious. "Miss Winters, you nearly died out there last night. I can't risk taking you back into that kind of cold. But the best thing you can do is stay here where it's warm," he insisted. "I'll find them if they're out there, I promise." Something in his steady gaze made her believe him. She nodded reluctantly. "Very well, but please be careful." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Been taking care of myself in these mountains for years, Miss Winters." "Josephine," she corrected him. "After what you've done for me, I think formality seems rather unnecessary." His smile widened slightly. "Josephine, then." He gathered supplies with efficient movements: rope, a canteen, extra blankets, his rifle. Watching him prepare, Josephine was struck by the quiet competence in everything he did. "I'll be back before sundown," he promised, moving toward the door. "There's more coffee in the pot and plenty of firewood stacked beside the hearth. Make yourself at home." After he left, the cabin felt suddenly larger and emptier. Josephine busied herself straightening the already neat space, then explored the bookshelves. To her surprise, she found volumes of Thoreau, Emerson, and even Shakespeare mixed among practical guides to ranching and animal husbandry. Intrigued, she selected a well-worn copy of Walden and settled in a chair by the fire. Hours passed as she read, occasionally rising to add wood to the fire or pour another cup of coffee. The quiet solitude was unlike anything she'd experienced in her busy Boston life, and she found herself relaxing into it. By mid-afternoon, however, worry began to creep in. The sun was already lowering toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow outside the windows. Jedediah had said he'd return before sundown, but there was no sign of him yet. Just as she was considering what she might do if he didn't return, the sound of approaching hoofbeats sent relief flooding through her. She hurried to the window, watching as Jed rode into view, leading a second horse behind him. She opened the door as he dismounted, immediately noting his grim expression. "Did you find them?" "I found the coach," he confirmed, securing both horses to the hitching post. "About 3 miles east, empty." Empty, hope and dread warred within her. Then they survived. "Tracks led toward town," he said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "Fresh enough that they couldn't have been more than a few hours ahead of me. Driver must have regained control and continued on, probably didn't even realize you were missing until they reached the next station." Josephine sank into a chair, relief making her knees weak. "Thank God. There's more," Jed said, pulling something from his saddlebag. "Found this in the snow near where you must have fallen." He handed her a small leather-bound book. Her journal, the one she'd been writing in just before the accident. "Oh, I thought it was lost forever. Thank you." He shrugged off her gratitude, moving to the stove to warm himself. "Trail to town is still dangerous, deep drifts in places, ice in others. We should wait until tomorrow before trying it." She asked, surprised. "I'll escort you to Silverton," he said as if it were obvious. "Wouldn't be right to let you travel alone after all this." Josephine was touched by his consideration. "That's very kind, but I've imposed on you enough already." He gave her a look that suggested he found her protest ridiculous. "It's no imposition. Besides, I need supplies from town anyway." With that settled, they fell into a comfortable routine preparing the evening meal together. Jed proved to be a better cook than Josephine had expected, teaching her how to make a hearty stew from venison he'd preserved. As they ate, she found herself asking the questions that had been forming since the previous night. "Why did you come out in that storm?" "You could have waited until it passed." Jed considered the question, absently turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Wasn't planning to, was just checking on the livestock in the barn when my horse started acting restless. Figured something was out there, wolf maybe, instead." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Found you. Lucky coincidence," she murmured. "Maybe," he said quietly, "or maybe not coincidence at all." The intensity in his gaze made her heart quicken unexpectedly. To distract herself, she asked about his ranch, and he spoke more freely than before about his small herd of cattle, his plans to expand, the challenges of ranching in the high country. "What about you?" he eventually asked. "What brings a Boston lady to teach in a rough mining town?" Josephine smiled, running her finger along the rim of her cup. "Is it that obvious I'm from Boston? Your accent," he said with a small smile, "and your clothes are too fine for anywhere else around here." She laughed, surprised by his perceptiveness. "My father was a physician there. He passed last year." The familiar pang of grief accompanied the words. "After Mother died when I was 16, it was just the two of us when he was gone." She shrugged. "There was nothing keeping me there. I saw an advertisement seeking a teacher for Silverton and thought perhaps a new start, somewhere completely different, was what I needed." "Brave decision," Jed commented, respect evident in his tone. "Silverton's no Boston." "That's rather the point," she admitted. "I wanted something real, something that mattered. Teaching children who might otherwise never learn to read or write that seems worthwhile." Jed studied her for a long moment. "Most people come west for gold or land or to escape something. Not many come to give something." His observation made her feel exposed somehow, seen in a way she wasn't accustomed to. "And you?" she asked. "You said you came west after the war for something different. Have you found it?" A shadow passed over his features. "Some days I think so. The mountains have a way of making a man feel small and significant all at once." He rose, taking their empty plates. "It's getting late. We should turn in if we're to reach town tomorrow." The sudden shift in his demeanor left Josephine wondering what she'd said wrong, but she didn't press. "Of course, I'll take the floor tonight. You've more than earned your bed back." "Absolutely not," he said firmly. "I've slept on harder ground than this floor plenty of times." Despite her protests, Jed was immovable on the subject. He arranged blankets near the fire for himself, then retreated outside to check on the horses one final time, giving her privacy to prepare for bed. Lying in the darkness later, listening to his steady breathing across the room, Josephine found herself replaying their conversations. There was something about Jedediah Porter that intrigued her, a depth beneath his quiet exterior, a gentleness belied by his rugged appearance. She fell asleep, wondering what his life was like when he wasn't rescuing stranded schoolteachers from blizzards. Morning brought clear skies and the promise of travel. They prepared for the journey in companionable silence, Jed packing supplies while Josephine tidied the cabin one last time. When he offered her his hand to help her mount the second horse, the one he'd brought back the day before, their eyes met briefly, and Josephine felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. The ride to Silverton took most of the day, the trail sometimes disappearing beneath snowdrifts that required careful navigation. Jed led the way, occasionally looking back to ensure she was managing. Though the sun shone brightly, the air remained bitterly cold, their breath forming clouds with each exhale. "There it is," Jed finally announced, pointing to a collection of buildings nestled in a valley ahead. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from a distance, Josephine could see people moving about the main street. Silverton was larger than she'd imagined from the descriptions in the advertisement, a proper town rather than a mere camp, with several streets of buildings radiating from a central square. As they rode in, curious glances turned their way. "The schoolhouse should be at the north end of town," Josephine said, consulting the letter of employment she'd kept carefully in her carpet bag. "Near the church." They found it easily enough, a modest clapboard building with a small bell tower. Next door stood an equally modest house that she assumed was the teacher's residence. Before they could approach, however, a portly man in a wool coat hurried toward them. "Miss Winters," he called, his face breaking into a relieved smile. "Oh, thank heavens. We feared the worst when the stagecoach arrived without you yesterday, Mr. Holloway," she guessed, recognizing the name of the town council chairman who had corresponded with her. "Indeed. We've had search parties out since dawn yesterday, but the storm made it nearly impossible." He looked to Jed with newfound appreciation. "And you, sir, have you rescued our new schoolmistress?" "She rescued herself mostly," Jed replied, dismounting and helping Josephine down. "Just happened to be in the right place." Introductions were made, explanations given, and soon a small crowd gathered around them, townsfolk eager to welcome their new teacher and thank the rancher who had brought her safely to them. "You must both be exhausted," Mr. Holloway said. "Miss Winters, your quarters are ready beside the school. And Mr. Porter, the town would be honored to provide you accommodations at the hotel for as long as you wish to stay." Josephine looked to Jed, suddenly reluctant to part ways with the man who had saved her life. "Will you stay, at least for tonight?" Something softened in his expression. "Got supplies to collect anyway," he agreed. "One night won't hurt." That evening, after being shown to her new home and having her few belongings delivered from the stagecoach office, Josephine found herself restless. The small house was comfortable enough, with basic furnishings and a well-stocked pantry courtesy of the town council, but after the intimacy of the cabin, it felt strangely empty. On impulse, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. The town was quieter now, most businesses closed for the evening, though light and piano music spilled from the saloon down the street. The hotel stood on the corner, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. Her feet carried her there before she could reconsider the propriety of her actions. In the small lobby, she inquired after Jed and was directed to the hotel's dining room where he sat alone at a corner table, a plate of food untouched before him. He looked up as she approached, surprise and something else pleasure, crossing his features as he rose to his feet. "Josephine. Is everything all right?" "Yes, perfectly fine," she assured him, suddenly feeling foolish. "I just wanted to thank you properly for everything." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Join me," she sat, aware of curious glances from the few other diners. "I realized I never asked when you plan to return to your ranch." "Tomorrow morning," he said, studying her with those perceptive blue eyes. "Unless there's reason to stay longer." The question in his words was unmistakable. Josephine felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I wouldn't want to keep you from your responsibilities." "Some responsibilities matter more than others," he replied quietly. A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Josephine gathered her courage. "I was thinking. That is, the school term doesn't begin for another week. Perhaps I could visit your ranch before then, to thank you properly for your kindness." The slow smile that spread across Jed's face made her heart race. "I'd like that very much. Would tomorrow be too soon?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Tomorrow would be perfect. The next morning, Josephine left a note for Mr. Holloway explaining her brief absence and rode out of town beside Jedediah Porter, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The journey to his ranch took them through breathtaking mountain scenery, the snow-covered landscape glittering in the sunlight. Jed's ranch proved to be more substantial than his modest demeanor had suggested. A sturdy main house, a large barn, corrals containing cattle and horses, all situated in a protected valley with a stream running through it. "It's beautiful," Josephine said sincerely as they dismounted. "It's home," Jed replied, a note of pride in his voice. "Built most of it myself." The main house was simple but well-crafted, with large windows offering views of the mountains. Inside, it bore the same thoughtful touches she'd noticed in the cabin books, sketches, handmade furniture that spoke of care and attention to detail. "You live here alone?" she asked, warming her hands by the stone fireplace. "Just me and the stock," he confirmed, hanging their coats. "Hire help during calving season and roundup, but otherwise," he shrugged, "never minded solitude much." "Until now." The words slipped out before she could reconsider them. Jed turned to her, his expression serious. "Until a blizzard blew a Boston schoolteacher into my life." The directness of his answer took her breath away. "Jedediah," he stepped closer, his voice low. "I know it's fast, know it doesn't make much sense, but something changed when I found you in that snow." He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "I'm not a man of many words, Josephine, but I'd like the chance to find them with you." Josephine thought of the path that had led her here, the losses, the decision to start anew, the near disaster in the blizzard. Standing before this man who had saved her life, who looked at her as if she were something precious, she recognized the opportunity fate had presented. "I'd like that too," she whispered. His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every chance to step away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning at first, then deepening as she responded, her hands finding their way to his shoulders. When they finally parted, breathless, Jed rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he murmured. "Not just today, stay." "I have a position," she reminded him, though the idea of leaving suddenly seemed impossible. Children expecting a teacher. Silverton's just a few hours' ride, he pointed out. Could make it work somehow. The hope in his voice made her smile. "Are you proposing a courtship, Mr. Porter?" "I'm proposing whatever you'll accept," he answered honestly. "Courtship, marriage, anything that keeps you in my life." Marriage. The word hung between them, startling in its suddenness yet somehow right. "We barely know each other," she said, though her heart argued otherwise. "I know you're brave enough to start a new life in a strange place," he said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Know you care more about helping others than yourself. Know you're stubborn enough to survive a blizzard and proper enough to worry what people might think of you staying in a bachelor's cabin." His smile turned tender. "And I know I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you." Tears pricked at Josephine's eyes. "How can you be so certain?" "Some things a man just knows," he said simply. "Like when a storm's coming, or when he's found what he's been looking for without realizing he was searching." Josephine thought of the emptiness she'd felt in Boston after her father's death, the restlessness that had driven her west, the strange sense of rightness she'd felt even in the midst of danger when Jed had found her in the snow. "I could teach here," she said slowly, an idea forming. "There must be children on nearby ranches who need education as much as those in town." Hope blazed in Jed's eyes. "There are. Families scattered through these valleys who can't send their children to town, especially in winter." "Then perhaps," she said, her decision crystallizing, "I've found exactly where I'm meant to be after all." His answering kiss was filled with promise of companionship in the solitude, of shared purpose, of a love born in the unlikely crucible of a winter storm. 3 months later, as spring began to thaw the high country, Josephine Winters became Josephine Porter in a simple ceremony at the Silverton Church. Mr. Holloway, initially disappointed to lose his town teacher, had been mollified by her promise to ride in twice weekly to teach there, in addition to the lessons she now offered to ranchers' children in the converted bunkhouse on Jed's property. Their wedding night, spent in the very cabin where he had once wrapped her in his arms to keep her alive, held none of the awkwardness either might have feared. Instead, they found in each other a passion equal to the tenderness that had grown between them through the winter months. "Did you ever imagine," Josephine asked later, her head resting on her husband's chest, "when you rode out in that blizzard that you'd find your wife?" Jed's laugh rumbled beneath her ear. "Never in my wildest dreams. Was just hoping to chase off a wolf." "And instead you found a lost Boston girl," she teased. His arms tightened around her. "Best thing I ever found." Outside, the spring wind whistled around the cabin, no longer threatening, but a reminder of the storm that had brought them together. Josephine closed her eyes, profoundly grateful for the blizzard that had nearly claimed her life, but had instead given her something far more precious. A love as vast and enduring as the Colorado mountains themselves.